A picture is worth more than 1,000 words. However, in modern web design, there's a bit more to it, and we'll take a look in today's video. The 4 HTML elements we'll be taking a look at in relation to images are the image element, the figure, the figcaption, and the picture element. The best way to visualize these 4 image-related elements is using a graduation picture. So the actual photograph, you can consider that as the image element. The frame around the photograph is your figure element. The little description that goes underneath is your figcaption. And when we talk about the picture element is when we have different images to fit different sizes. Continuing on from our last lesson, we're now going to be adding an image into the Our Story section. So I'll head over to the builder and I'm going to highlight the div that I designated to wrap the image. Next, I'll go into the element inserter and search for my image element. It is under the multimedia and embeds category. So now we've inserted our image element, but nothing shows up on the screen. Why? Because we need to now add some attributes that will now tell the browser exactly the source of the image and then improve the accessibility as well as performance. So now let's see some of the attributes that we can add. The typical attribute that we're going to add first is the source of the image. For that, we're going to be selecting an image from our media library if we have one. Let's click on Select Image. At the moment, there is no image in the media library. So now I'm going to look for an image from my local directory. So I'll click on the Upload and I'll insert an image from my local folder. So now I've inserted the image, highlight it. You can now choose the exact image source that you want. So to give you all of the image sizes, so you can choose the one that you want and then you can insert. So what that will do is it will insert the URL of the image and it will also pull in the alt text and other attributes if you've added them in your media library. Since I've not added anything, everything is blank. Coming to the next attribute, which is the alt text. How do we decide an alt text for an image? It can be a bit confusing for a lot of us. So I'm going to leave a document in the description where you can go ahead and read about the Alt Decision Tree by the W3C. So basically it gives you a set of questions you ask yourself to determine what type of alt text you would use for an image. Then I'll also recommend that when you're trying to describe an image, you can use AI to give you a starting point to describe the image and then rewrite it in your own words to fit the purpose of that image. Okay, so what I've done now, I've gone to Claude, I've just inserted the image and told it to generate an alt text for me. This is not how you would typically do it. You give it a bit more context, but I'm just giving it a standard context. And I'm just going to copy the alt text that it gave me. And now we can go back to the builder and insert our alt text. Please ensure that you insert an alt text, or if it is a decorative image, ensure that you still insert an alt attribute that is blank. Do not completely remove the alt attribute. Okay, so now we've decided the alt text. The next thing we need to decide is the loading. So there are 3 types of loading. We have auto, lazy, and eager. Lazy loading is best when the image is below the fold. So basically it's an image that doesn't show up on first load. It's when you scroll down that you now go ahead and see the image. So that kind of image, you typically designate it as lazy. But if it is the hero image or like your site logo, you typically use the eager loading method. And you can go ahead and learn about all of the attributes that you can put into an image from something like Claude or Gemini, or go to the MDN docs and learn about the different attributes that you can use. So right now we have done the source, the alt, and we are talking about the loading method. So for this image, it is going to be below our hero section. So it's going to be below the fold. So for that, I can just say the loading method is lazy. So I've filled the core attributes. Now we can add some extra attributes by going to the attribute section. As you can see, this is one nice thing about Builderius is that every attribute that you add in the regular builder under primary, you can still see them within the attributes category. So you can manipulate your attributes here because everything is always synced together. So if you delete the alt text from the attribute section, it will delete it from the primary section because they are always synced together. So now the other attribute that you may want to add to improve performance by reducing this cumulative layout shift that we see when we go on Lighthouse is you click on the attributes and you define the exact width and the exact height of the image. So for this image, the exact width is 800 pixels, but when you're defining the width and height as HTML attributes, you do not define the pixel unit, just the value itself. So you say width is 800 and then the height is 600. So now I've defined everything for the actual image. And what this then does is that once it is loading in the browser, before it even loads your CSS and other things, tells the browser that, oh yeah, this is the size that has been allocated to the image. Okay, so now these are some of the core attributes that you will typically put in an image. Everything is ready to go like this. But then when you want to now improve it a bit for accessibility reasons, and by accessibility, I mean that for people who have maybe weak connection or their mobile data is limited and things like that, you can now provide some extra image sources to the browser so that the browser can now pick whichever image it feels is the best image for the use case. And those attributes that we typically use are two attributes. The attributes are the source set and the sizes attribute. So those two attributes tend to work together. So the source set allows you to provide a list of different image files for different screen resolutions. And it can also be for like when you have a standard screen and a retina screen, you just define one as the 1x and the other one as 2x, like that. So let's go ahead and see an example of how we will use this in our project. So I'll go back to my builder. Let me go ahead and save first. Then I would use a plugin right now called Admin and Site Enhancements to show you the different sizes of images so that we can easily copy the source URL and the size of the image. But that is just me showing you. You don't really need the plugin, but this is an easy way to visualize it. So I'll head over to the image, then I'll go over to the details, and then you can see all of the sizes of the image. We have the full size. It tells you the width and the height for each of the different sizes. So now let's say we want to define some extra images that the browser might use. What we're just going to be using are the URL of the image as well as the width property. So I'll copy the first image and we'll go back to the builder, define a new attribute called source set, that is srcset. So we'll define the first URL, space, and then we will define the width that it's supposed to take up. It's supposed to take up 800 pixels, but we're just going to be saying 800 and then the W after that as the unit. So that is the width is 800. I'll put a comma. I'll go back and choose another size, maybe the medium size. And for that, the width is 300. So let's go back. And then I'll come to the end, paste that next URL, and I'll define the width again. So this one, the width is 300W. And that's it. So let's say I've just defined those two, and I'm happy with those two sizes. Then the next thing we now want to do is also tell the browser that at different screen resolutions, what space is the image taking up. So we can now go to a new attribute and we call that the sizes attribute. Let's look at the explanation of the sizes attribute. And the sizes attribute tells the browser how much space the image will take up on the screen at different breakpoints, helping it to choose the right file from the source set. So it is a combination with the source set. So I can come back to my image and we can now start defining sizes. So the way we define the sizes is we start with a typical media query. So for example, I can put in brackets max width of, let's say, 768 pixels. And let's look at the example of this website. Let me go ahead and inspect it. And you see that when it is above 768 pixels, the image takes up probably about 40 of the viewport width. Let's just give an example. Let's say maximum is 50 of the viewport width. But then when it goes down to a smaller screen size, it takes up the full viewport width. So what we now say is that at a maximum width of the screen of 768 pixels, we want the image to take up the full width of the screen. But then at other screen sizes, the image is going to take up, we can use some calc functions if we want, but I'm just going to assume that it's going to take up about 50 viewport width. So we'll go back to the builder, and now we'll see that when the max width is 768 pixels, the image is taking up 100 viewport width. Then comma, otherwise it's going to be taking up 50 viewport width. This is just an example. And now we can go ahead and save it. And we have all of our properties set up. We can now go ahead and preview it on the front end. So I'll go ahead and preview. And we have all of the attributes that we need to create an image. I can inspect it using my browser dev tools, and you see everything about the image in the browser. So everything that we've defined in the browser, it shows up in the source set. We have the width, the height. What this is now going to do is it will now prevent all of those layout shifts that happen when the browser is loading, because at load time, the browser is not loading up your CSS first, it's loading up the HTML first. And so it doesn't really know the width and height of your image until after the CSS is loaded. But once you've defined all of these attributes, the browser now knows exactly what to load way before the CSS is even loaded. Okay, so now that's it for the image. The next thing we're going to be focusing on now is, we've talked about the image itself. What about the frame that covers the image? And that is the figure tag. Looking at the MDN docs, the figure HTML element represents self-contained content. Now let's go ahead and look at the usage notes. And it says, usually a figure is an image, illustration, diagram, code snippet, etc. that is referenced in the main flow of a document, but that can be moved to another part of the document or to an appendix without affecting the main flow. So what they mean here is that if you have an image that is having an ancestor of maybe an article or the main tag, and that image can be moved around that article or around the main tag, if the main is its direct ancestor, it can be moved around without affecting the flow of the document. Then you can wrap your image in a figure tag. But if your image is directly part of a sentence, for example, you say something like, you have a statement or a quote, and then you have an image that is directly linked to the quote, or you have like your site logo as a link. So the site logo and maybe some accompanying text are directly like connected as a full sentence within your site logo link, then you cannot use a figure tag for that. It's also further explained in the HTML Living Standard, where it says that self-contained in this context does not necessarily mean independent. For example, each sentence in a paragraph is self-contained. An image that is part of a sentence would be inappropriate for a figure tag. So if the image is directly related to the text that follows the image, then it is not expected to use a figure tag for that. But in this example, what we have here is an image, and we also even have accompanying caption for the image. So this is a perfect example for when we can use a figure tag. So for that, I can now come back to my builder, and the wrapper container that I used for the image, initially we set it out as a div. So now to improve the semantic HTML, we now change the HTML tag from a div to a figure tag. And now we have better HTML structure. So I can go ahead and save it. And I can now go ahead and add my fig caption. So to add the fig caption, please note that your fig caption must either be the first element or the last element in your figure. It cannot be in between. So keep that in mind. So go ahead and add an element, and I'll look for the fig caption element and add it as the last item within the figure. Then let me go ahead and copy my fig caption. And I'll paste the fig caption within the primary content area. And we have our image completed. We're not talking about styling yet. That will be in a different lesson. The last element we take a quick look at is the picture element. And it allows us to define alternative versions of an image for different display and device scenarios. So the way we describe it is we start with a wrapper picture element, then we define the source, and that source can have a couple of attributes that are similar to the image element itself, but they add some extra attributes. So some of those attributes that we can include are, we can define first the source set, which is the actual URL of the image. We can now define a media query if we want. We can even define the type of image. So let's say maybe the browser doesn't yet support an AVIF format. So you can define that, okay, if the browser can support the type of AVIF, show it. Otherwise, fall back to a WebP version and so on. We can also define, similar to image attributes, we have the sizes attribute, the width, and the height attribute. So you can define all of these, and you can learn more about it in the MDN docs. But I'm just going to take a simple example in this case. So I'll go back to my builder, and now I'm going to insert the picture element. So I'll click on the element inserter, and I'll search for the picture element, and I'll add the picture element in there. And basically, we want the picture element to be the wrapper for the image itself, not the wrapper for the figure, because picture is directly related to images. So we have the picture element. It comes with a source element and an image element. But since we already defined our image at the top, I can delete the default image element and replace it with my own new image element. Then I will move the picture element itself above the fig caption. Okay, so we're back to where we started. You can see that on screen, nothing really changed. It still looks the same. But now we can go ahead and define some different sources. It doesn't have to be one source. You can have multiple sources, and you define depending on different circumstances. So a typical starting point is to define the URL. So I'll select an image. I'm going to select a new image that I uploaded. And right away, because we've not defined any media query or type or anything like that, the source now becomes the main image. It doesn't use the fallback image. But now we can now go ahead and define things like a media query and say, maybe, for example, we want this image to only show up on smaller screen sizes. So what I'll do is I'll go over to the attributes, and then I'll say media is at a max width of 768 pixels, then it should show this image. So you see, now it's falling back to the other image, but the moment I go over to a smaller screen size, it switches to the image I defined in my source. So that is one way you can use it. You can also define things like AVIF format, like I mentioned previously, and other kinds of attributes. So everything will be in the description. You can learn more, and we'll show you some examples in the accompanying article. So I hope you've learned a bit more about images, about the different attributes you can add to an image, and how you can improve the accessibility as well as performance. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at the other sections on our page, which include lists. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.